Welcome to Grokchain Conversations. This podcast is presented by a multidisciplinary group of legal, financial, and technology professionals to meet and discuss today's most pressing questions around the use and governance of the blockchain. Through roundtable dialogue, we will provide listeners with a full spectrum of views on where this technology is today and where it might be leading. The information provided on the Grokchain Conversations is for educational purposes only. The information provided does not constitute legal, investment, financial, tax, accounting, or any other professionally licensed advice. The views expressed here are those of the individuals, not those of their respective employers or Grokchain. Today's question: how might legislators and regulators across jurisdictions think about and agree upon rules that will allow blockchain and cryptocurrency startups to challenge industry incumbents while at the same time protecting incumbents from these challenges? The participants in today's conversation are Fabrizio Romano Genovese, Andrej Muzevic, Alessandro Daliana, Jennifer Maisel, and Christopher Ott. More information about the participants can be found in the show notes below.
Would anybody like to start off, or should I start off? I think Andrej should start off.
Yeah, let's get him on board.
Let's get Andrej talking here.
Yeah, sure. So the most important thing when helping young industries that have a potential to change how we organize societies, which blockchain just might have, is understanding we don't understand much. And from what I've seen is like when you go through all the noise of some obvious scams in the industry, there's an unprecedented innovation happening in front of our eyes. And the question for regulators would be how to nurture this and yet protect people from the blatant and obvious scams. So it's not an easy task. I've been around this industry for years now. I don't consider myself an expert, let's say an observer, and there's so much to learn and understand. And this is like watchful waiting would be the word. So like trying to understand and nurture. So I don't have a simple answer how the regulator could do anything today. And like the country I come from, we're having an ongoing debate on taxation, and it seems that the regulator understood the novelty and kept the things broad enough for the past few years, and now they're trying to narrow towards something constructive. But taxation is just one of the many fields involved here. So to cut this short, it's just about understanding the importance of innovation, yet protecting people from the really maybe even predominant scamminess around some of the spaces here.
I think you said some important things there, but I think there's a very fundamental distinction that regulators or anybody who wants to operate in this industry has to understand. And there's a really, really big difference between using a network that uses distributed computing and having an asset that nobody can destroy, nobody can take, censorship resistance as we call it, and a blockchain network where somebody can actually shut off the network. They have enough control over it. So when the regulator is looking at the network, yeah, it's fine to look at all these financial applications because for all intents and purposes, those are the closest models that we have to use on this type of technology. But it's the financial part's really not that important per se, financial products part. The real difference is that portability, the portability of your asset. So I think when looking at a project, whether you're an entrepreneur or a lawyer, a regulator, or even a legislator. There has to be a really clear distinction made between decentralized computing and centralized, and some degrees in between there. But there's a reason why Bitcoin and Ethereum are the highest priced cryptocurrencies out there. They are the most distributed networks that exist, as far as we know.
They also have the most established culture. So one thing that I think is important with with a question like this is to understand that the way you want to solve the problem and maybe protect people from scams and whatever is inherently political. And the important thing to keep in mind here is that blockchains aren't unexplored territory. Bitcoin exists since more or less 2008, 2009. Ethereum launched in 2014. So, it's like 7-10 years of building and of people using this thing and building stuff on it. These people created their own ethos and their own culture. So for instance, if you look at, especially some crowds in the Bitcoin ecosystem, they are strong libertarians. And probably what they would tell you is, well, if you are stupid enough to fall for a scam, that's not my problem. So there should be no protection at all, and people should just do their due diligence. That's a view I do not agree upon. I do not agree with, but the point is, I think it's impossible to regulate these spaces, without starting from the point of view that these spaces are not, blank. They've been inhabited and a culture developed in them for a long time. So I think the first thing would be probably to establish discussions with people that have been working in these spaces for a long time, trying to understand what are their views, like what is their ethos, what kind of ethical system do they follow, and trying to keep also this into account.
I think you're right. I mean, this has existed for a long time, but I think even before Bitcoin, one of the curious things about discussions in this space is when you have a distributed network, the ethos is that of open source software development. And it's a very strong approach that is used in this industry because it's distributed computing for those networks that are distributed. Where they end up having a bit of a conflict is this is the first time that you're developing open source software, but that has a value intrinsic. So everyone is trying to reconcile open source software development with, we'll call it corporate software development. And you can't, they're two different animals. They respond to two different market requirements. So yes, you can talk about culture, the culture that exists in each one of these communities and how it's developed and fine, but that happens in a regular company as well. All companies have their own corporate culture, however misguided it may be, given the Great Resignation.
I'll jump in there on this proprietary versus open software. And, to follow up on some other points, we're not dealing with a blank slate here. And from the regulatory perspective, following up on Andrej's point about the innovation versus regulation debate, I can speak from experience, at least in the US. Whenever there's a new breakthrough technology, the legislators are playing catch up, the regulators are too. But us attorneys, we're litigating in court. And I think we've seen a lot of litigations crop up in the blockchain space to address some of what I'll call the classic harms, for money laundering, for fraud, for class action, derivative suits, things of that nature. We have a trademark case that's ongoing. And I think that some of our existing regulatory framework does apply to blockchain technology, as new as it may be. So we do have some tools already in our playbook to use and regulate this industry. And I do think that legislators are looking at what's happening in that space to see, hey, where are the biggest abuses happening? And on the decentralization aspect, I can speak from the artificial intelligence and machine learning community. For example, the issue of bias. Bias is a well-documented problem in these autonomous systems, some of which are distributed, and maybe with zero human interaction at one end of it. And we saw litigation in that space long before we've seen a lot of the regulatory action now trying to address and mitigate against bias and improve transparency. So I think part of this conversation can focus on those litigation trends that are happening in the US and around the world and seeing where those greatest abuses are falling. And I think that's where the legislators and regulators are going to step in first.
And that can kind of be my cue, I guess, because with the litigation, costs money. So it's a good way of figuring out amongst the community what matters to them, right? Like what fundamentally matters. And to take a step back to the original question, how should the regulators, the lawmakers be thinking about it? They have to take a step back and say what matters. Now, what matters to them? It is going to be a huge mess to wade into the systems themselves and regulate, right? But what may matter the most to them is, okay, what about at the point where they are gathering capital to build up these systems? That's something that we can work by way of analogy to other investments in other technologies, right? It's at least a useful way to talk about it. Now, I'm aware that Alessandro's got this, is thinking in an ongoing and sophisticated way about where the tipping point of decentralization is. And that's something that the regulators have to think about too. But the step back they have to say is, where do our existing interests and powers overlap with what we've got here? Now, if you got a new company starting up that's trying to fund the building of one of these technologies, the analogy seems stronger to what exists in a very fundamental sense. When the network is up and ongoing, the problems are harder, right? Like maybe the tax questions are the only question left when it comes to these networks. You've got a thing of value. And the classic way of addressing tax questions is, where's the point when they're cashing out of an asset and moving it to something else? Like real estate investments in gold, tax authorities usually aren't interested until there's a realization event. And maybe that's the tipping point. But the regulators have to think about where those lines are and what makes sense. And Jen's right, looking at the litigation will help them figure that out. A lot of the litigation has to do with the fundraising aspect of this. That is also overlaps with what Fabrizio is calling the scamminess. That's where a lot of the concerns are. They should think about where's the right place to intervene on that.
There's also, I think, this problem that since smart contracts and all this kind of stuff are usually based on cryptography assumptions and things like that, there are some contexts in which you cannot really enforce a decision. So the most standard thing I can think about is, if I have an hardware wallet and I have the keys of that wallet, I am the only one that is able to spend the coins in my wallet. Now, the regulator can come to me and say, well, you have to give that money back. But, I can just say no. Okay, maybe I go to jail, but I get to keep my money. You know what I mean? And by the way, as soon as I told this to like a lot of my entrepreneur friends here in Italy, where, the fiscal authority is quite strong and there is a lot of bureaucracy, and sometimes these people got, their bank accounts frozen for months because of ongoing investigations, even if they were found innocent in the end. As soon as I told them this, they were like, so you are telling me that I can keep an operative margin that the law cannot freeze in any way, and I get to spend that money anyway in any circumstance? Like, yeah, well, that's. And they were like, whoa. For them, this was one of the best kind of application scenarios of crypto. And same thing with like Tornado Cash. With Tornado Cash, you can anonymously send money to someone else, you can disclose to who you send the money, but people cannot force to disclose you to do so, because again, it's basically mathematically impossible to be able to do so. So there is this problem of, I think, drafting the regulation while keeping in mind that regulation cannot always be enforced. And so it's somehow more similar to international law, maybe, where you don't have, like a bigger authority that can force you to do things, but it's more like laws are some kind of game theory thing where, I don't know, like you can break a treaty, but if you do it, it's going to backfire with some undesired effects. And so it's strategically not convenient for you to do so. But it's not as someone is coming to knock at your door and say, hey, you have to give me this, and they force you to do so. So there's also this aspect that I think is very, very interesting and new.
Well, the international law is an interesting point on that front, because international law is arguably our oldest law. Right? Like certainly when it comes to fiscal matters, things like the trade terms have been the same like back to Sumerian times. The aspect of full on board, etc. And those things evolved and are enforceable independent of the individual nation states. It's just an understanding of the way business is done. Now, maybe that's the way things will develop in this space, but man, it'll be rocky to get to that point.
Yeah.
That'll be a real problem. And to pick up on something you said, I think a real challenge for regulators is the pseudonymous nature of a lot of these technologies. But this is something you raised earlier too, Fabrizio, the early days of the internet. That's something that was a real thrill about that too, right? But the pseudonymous nature of the internet is largely evaporated. There's maybe a layer of anonymity, but it doesn't hold up very well. I mean, like the counterintelligence work I did with the Department of Justice, we were able to get underneath those people's pseudonymous layers relatively quickly. And part of that is that with the attention economy, those big companies, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Twitters, are expending a lot of engineering power to pierce through that for advertising purposes. They want to find out exactly who you are so they can target ads at you. Now, there's not a similar industrial complex in crypto, but we're a lot younger. It took 20 plus years before that industrial complex was built up in the internet. If I had to say, the tipping point was around 2008 to 2010 on that. It's still an interesting challenge for the regulators because they're not used to it. They want to know who they're dealing with, if for nothing else.
Well, you actually bring up a good point, especially with regard to the time period. There is a very strong, I guess, history, if not culture, in this particular industry that Web 1.0 technologies were overtaken by, we'll call them incumbents, for lack of a better word. We'll call them manufacturers, because that's basically what they are. And this, why is the recording not the camera not flipping to me? Oops. I do this. Nope. Oh well, all I see is Fab.
I don't know. I'm in gallery view, so I see everyone.
We can hear. It might be you're on the same screen depending on your interface. You're not on the screen where you see the primary speaker.
Yeah, I do. I have what are they called? Thumb shots above, and then a big screen.
But it's you. It's showing you when you talk. It's showing you in green, so you are the talker. You have the word, so I think it's okay.
Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. Text messages don't work. Right.
Yeah, you left off, Alessandro, talking.
Okay. Yeah, there is a strong sense that a lot of these companies that are now, the dominant players in the IT industry were actually taken over by incumbent companies to serve their purpose. So if you think about Facebook back in the beginning, You know, you could make all sorts of apps and connect to it, and you could use the databases, and you can get all the information about people. And you had software developers who were building businesses based on this technology and being able to connect with that database, with all of that rich data. It was then, Facebook was then taken over, or the perception is that it was taken over and turned into ad tech. So we went from a period where these networks were considered social networks to a period where they were considered social media networks. There was a change in language that occurred, and they were turned into devices to essentially help with the supply chain and the efficiencies in the supply chain and getting products from the manufacturer to the consumer. During COVID, this is even accelerated more with all of the home delivery services that have popped up. And in a way, crypto is a bit of a backlash, a response to what's been going on, what we call surveillance capitalism, whether it's in the US, Europe, China, it don't make a difference. India. It's just a question of who gets to surveil you. It's either the Chinese government or it's Google, don't matter. So this technology actually allows to break with that way of rendering the internet productive and moving it more towards away from this corporate capture and more towards the individual. So I'm going to challenge you guys to think about the blockchain as a socio-economic network. It's not really about what's going on the internet. It's what's going on in the real world. I think Fab and Andre remember when Facebook changed its name to Metaverse, or Meta. We had a lot of discussions about this because, no, I'm drawing a blank now. Oh, damn, my thought disappeared, sorry.
No, but I can continue on this.
Thank you. Since you were at that other conversation.
Yeah, the challenge with blockchain is there are so many things happening simultaneously. Why I'm so maybe not sure about where we are is because like our fundamental infrastructure hasn't been built yet, and there's so much so-called success. So this is like we're mentioning Facebook, which is, let's say, a mature technology, already pivoting on its monetization models and so on. Whilst here, we don't even have what I would call a fully functional proof of stake, like the basic building block. And we have many blockchains that are challenged, that are saying they have solved this like a long time ago. So the problem here is like even defining what blockchain is a problem. So from a regulatory point of view, yes, like we as people working on the social part, which is I think the most important part of this, because this is like it's a socio-economical project first, then technological in my opinion, but that makes it more difficult, not less difficult, and more prone to capture even than internet. Because like here, decentralization, I don't think any of the project is as decentralized as they claim to be. So this is like even, and I know you mentioned this a lot, Alessandro, saying like there's a line, decentralized, not decentralized. I don't see this line as straight.
No. You can calculate, I'm sorry, but Fab can speak to this better than I can. You can actually calculate mathematically what the level of risk is for a particular network. You know, proof of stake, for example, if you've got 1/3 of the nodes that are Byzantine, then it doesn't work anymore. If you're using a proof of work system, you're subject to 51% of tax. If I went to JP Morgan to open up a bank account, and they told me that they had a 30% chance of screwing things up, or 50% chance of screwing things up, I would never ever use their service.
I think it's actually more complicated than that, because you can.
Because there are all the assumptions that go before that. But...
No, you can. I mean, you can quite easily and reasonably study mathematically the point of, the degree of censorship resistance and of consensus, for instance. But that's not the only thing at play here. I think that the blockchain space, the crypto space at the moment, is immensely centralized when you think about reputation system. If Vitalik tomorrow says, oh, this coin is bullshit, that coin is going to drop consistently. Luckily for us, that's not something that, it does often. But the point is that there are very influential people that are basically able to decide the destiny of a project. And if that project is tokenized in some way, they are basically able to decide the destiny of all the investors in that project. If I'm influential enough, I could literally dump a coin on purpose to buy it back, or pump a coin on purpose to sell it. And that's
Chris likes that kind of stuff.
That's basically what crypto influencers do on a day-to-day basis. And
but those are scammy projects. That's not.
No, it's not a problem of scammy projects. It's a problem that we have few people that are hugely influential in this space. People like Michael Saylor, people like Vitalik, and others. They're it's very. I mean, what they say really impacts the network in a lot of ways. If tomorrow, news would come out saying, oh, the launch of Ethereum 2.0 is delayed by 3 years because of this and that, like the price of Ethereum would crash instantly. And it doesn't matter if these are, fake news or not. What matters is that someone very influential say that. This has nothing to do with, the mathematical sanity of the algorithm that is running the chain underneath.
Right, but I was answering Andrej's assertion that I'm looking at that dividing line, the dividing line between distributed and not distributed.
But this is part of the dividing line.
That's what Fabrizio is saying. That's the point. Like, you have the math, but then you have a single person influencing your math. Because like if someone, so this is the trick. It's not mature enough. So like paper can take anything. So you have the equipment, but because this is social first, like, can we have a consensus, like to change the network consensus system? Of course. So like we can do pretty much anything because this is social first, and we do not know how to calculate politics. And in current system of politics, it's hugely centralized with people having most of the power. So then all the idea about centralization, putting one project on one side, the other on the other side, sort of is weak. And this is why I'm so not ready to say like we're so much better in the Ethereum because we are more decentralized. But what does more decentralized mean? It's like I think it's a process. And if a regulator thinks that this is already over and it's enough to just show good math, enough nodes, so like many projects can do that, because like a lot of projects that are going after Ethereum and Bitcoin, like you put some clear regulation, they will comply. But that will not make them more secure or more decentralized. I'm just saying this is still evolving. Even though we have like 12 years behind us, like the most is ahead of us. And it's still developing, and I don't know how it will pan out at the end. So like everybody's happy with the fact, okay, my project has been deemed decentralized enough by the regulator, so good for me. But in practice, one person can crash the project. I don't think they can crash the project, but can influence it in a way that might make a regulator think differently. So this is why I'm back to watchful waiting. Yes, we have litigation, obviously we need to have. There are a lot of scams, but saying that we have figured this out, that the basic research is over, that like the base stack is already ready, let's regulate it, I would challenge this. I would say it's not. We're still early in development, even though we're making so much applications use, people are getting rich from this technology, which is not even ready yet. So if you look at the people developing on it, and I'm helping projects develop, like this is really not something that one would consider industrially ready. And some projects can work around this and make applications that are ready for commercial use. But in practice, this is still like basic technology that needs a lot of development and refinement.
I agree. That's not, it's not a question of whether the technology is mature or not. That's going to happen over time. The fact that there's this business model that we've never seen before, that's native to the existence of the internet, opens up a certain number of opportunities and possibilities. That's what we're talking about, that will be developed over time. To go back to what Chris was saying before about there being similarities. Yeah, if I raise money and I build a network, sure, I'm raising money and I'm building a network, fine. I look like I'm issuing equity for my company or a convertible note or whatever. But what I was trying to say was, okay, fine, but there are a whole bunch of things that go underneath that go within that idea of raising capital. So if I'm building a company, I need, my IT development team, I need my architect, I need, my marketers, I need my back office administration, blah, 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 all of these different things. And all of these different things are being controlled by a small group of people. That looks like a company. But if I develop in another way, I'm need money, okay? Knowing that I can also do it in an open source manner. But I'm not going to do the marketing. I'm not going to do the community development. I'm not going to do the business development. I'm going to have different partners that do that. Do I still look like a company? Not really. I look more like a consortium. If I can start with a consortium, then maybe I can create other opportunities that are more socially based because I'm starting from a more social approach to my network development.
I'll challenge that a little bit, Alessandro.
I would be disappointed if you didn't.
It's an interesting perspective, but hearing this conversation about the evolution of blockchain, legal scholars have said for years, originally with the development of the internet, this concept of code is law. And I'm thinking back to the point about enforceability and things like that. And Alessandro, we can develop a system in a decentralized way, but at the end of the day, the consensus mechanism, the underlying software, the hardware that it's running on, there are some things about the system that are going to affect the behavior of the people that are using it. I think that's inextricably intertwined together. And there is a playbook out there. There are projects, I've heard the term scammy projects thrown around on here. There are projects out there that failed for one reason or another, or were otherwise bad socially for promoting certain kinds of behavior. And there is a rule book, I think. And to your point, even if the development is decentralized, if it's a consortium or whatever that organization looks like, at the end of the day, someone's making a decision about how to encode and build these systems. And I would argue that that person is liable for the decisions that they potentially make in that design, having this rule book in front of them and this playbook of what's happened before. Well, so yeah, go ahead.
That's super dangerous. I mean, from the developer perspective, this is exactly what I would never want to hear. I mean, I would run as fast as I can from regulation like that. Because you're saying that, I don't know, I create the code of stablecoin, and maybe people use this stablecoin to launder money or do something, and then all of a sudden I am legally liable because of this. that is the best way to, for me to decide that I don't want to develop anything in my life anymore. These by far is, by all means, this is not a tenable position if we want to do anything but destroying completely the blockchain space, 100%.
Yeah.
Well, this is because there's so many layers here. This is the layer when you develop a code and that code is implemented, but it's not your decision. So you suggest the code. The code needs to be accepted. So this is the point where, yes, in centralized project, one company runs it. And this is I think the most problematic part here is just gathering the money to start the chain. This is something where I see that regulator could say you were raising money for this and this reason, and this is complex. But the next part, when we come to the developing on this, in theory, optimally, many teams, the centralized way would have these suggestions how to make the network better, and then there's a mechanism how this is implemented. So, and the guy that offered this, he's not the one that changed.
No, for me, this is more like saying that Friedrich Nietzsche should be considered a war criminal because Nazis used part of his philosophy in their ethos. Okay. And, it doesn't work. He was long gone and dead when they abused this philosophical framework. And the problem is that I'm pretty sure he had no idea and didn't envision anyway, his philosophy, being abused in that way. And this is the same thing. You can, in total good faith, put out some code today. The people that coded Tornado Cash, for instance, I think they had privacy in mind as first concern. They were like, I don't want the whole world to know what I buy with my crypto. And then clearly people can abuse this system to launder money and do other shady things. But are these developers, legally responsible for the behavior of the users on their platform? That is a very complicated question, but in many cases, I would say no, they are not. So, yeah.
Right, but you have to consider whether it's open source development or not. There are plenty of open source projects that are out there that are buggy, that have problems, that are evolving, that I don't know, they're version 10 after 20 years or something. I think everybody is aware of the fact that if you're using open source software, you're using it on an as-is basis.
I think that's right. To go back to my point, if you are a developer or a business or whatever you are, and you are developing a product that is going to be used to cause harm to people, I'm thinking from the product's liability perspective. If you put a dangerous product out there on the market, there's tons of precedent for holding the manufacturer liable for it. I think if you're a software programmer and there's an unintended consequence, that's a different story. But if you are this consortium, decentralized or not, and you are pushing a product or pushing a use of a product.
Unincorporated consortium, not an incorporated. Sorry.
Or a DAO, whatever.
No, don't use that word. not in this call.
There's this interesting question of, who's liable in these decentralized systems, and someone's going to have to hold that.
It's a feature. If you want someone to produce good code that can actually, hold your dollars and cents or yen or whatever it is, you want them to be, to have the fear of God in them. You want them to feel the weight of that responsibility and that liability. It's part of the game. It's part of the incentive structure that exists.
I get what Jen is saying, but I think that in practice, it's I guess it's very difficult, in the vast majority of cases to be able to demonstrate that the developer was aware of the fact that they were putting, something risky out there. For things like people providing schematics for 3D printing guns or things like that, I would guess it's easier because, if you're giving me the schematics of an AR-15, whatever, to assemble an assault rifle, yeah, you should, at least in my opinion, you should be somehow, like legally responsible for that.
I'm glad you that assault weapon could be dangerous.
Yes. Yeah, I know it's not a totally obvious thing to think, unfortunately. But sure.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'd say in general, Fab, the lines though are going to be just like in the law. They're going to be interesting, but they're going to be clearer more often than not. Like, you know, the machine gun thing is a situation where they put out the schematics out for free, so they're not making any money, but also the danger is clear, right? But the person who invented the idea of 3D printing, the connection is not clear, right? Even though the danger can flow with an unbroken line from it. You don't really need to wring your hands that much over that issue. You could dig a swimming pool in a public park, right? Break all the laws to do that and not put a fence around it. The danger's pretty clear on that a kid will fall in and drown, right? And also the fact that you're breaking other laws to get it done. I think for most of these projects, the clear line that's going to be there is, are they profiting on an ongoing basis from their network, even though they say it's out there? Like for a lot of these stable coins, they're getting ongoing money for these transactions. Now, the idea of them having some ongoing regulatory responsibility for continuing to profit from that network seems to make sense. But also makes sense that the mysterious Bitcoin founder is not necessarily on the hook for everything flowing from Bitcoin, because that's closer to the Euclidean ideal of what you're talking about. He put that idea out there and said, go forth and disrupt. But these are things we have to wrestle with because the lines are interesting. and yeah, Nietzsche, under that paradigm I'm talking about, Nietzsche's not in trouble, right? Machiavelli's not in trouble. But
he's always in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, you know, he may have a different view, shouting at us from the third circle of hell, but it's not in trouble, I guess, with the cops, right? or the SEC or the regulators. Yeah, I mean, these are interesting things to talk out, but the process of talking about makes things clearer more often than not. I found.
I don't know. I'm also curious to know, what is your opinion about is civil law or common law more adequate to, you know, rule on these kind of questions? Because I guess that in common law, in the end, it will come to a jury deciding, you know, if the developer was liable or not. Well, probably in civil law, it's more like a question of drafting the laws in a certain way and interpreting them in a certain way, and probably one system will work better than the other.
It's slightly more complicated than that, even, Fab, because from the tenor of your question, I could tell you're thinking about this from a Napoleonic Code kind of perspective, which is
He's Italian. He's from Naples.
Yeah.
That's can't get more Napoleonic than Naples, right? Which
is different, not better or worse, but different from the Anglo-American approach to these things. So fundamentally, the way the litigations and the laws are going to play out in Australia, the UK, the US, and Canada is going to be different than it's going to play out in France and Italy. Now, it doesn't mean the outcomes are going to be different, but the process could be different. And as we well know, the process can drive the outcomes in certain circumstances.
Yeah, that's what I was asking exactly.
Yeah.
So,
and I guess the answer is it depends. Now, where we are right now, in the Anglo-American system, which is what Jen and I know best, it's going to be civil litigation, common law that's going to be driving this because it's the most flexible, and it's also the one that an individual has the access to. And then as a final point, it's faster. Now, it's not to say that civil litigation is fast, but it's fundamentally faster to get some kind of recourse for a perceived wrong in court in a lawsuit than it is to force some action from a regulator or lawmakers. In our system, you're just going to get an outcome faster. So that you're going to get data points on wrestling with these issues faster from the litigation. And where we are on that is not necessarily where we're going to end up, but the process of talking and deliberating through that is going to be useful to building these norms. I see in a lot of these spaces, Jen and I both do a lot of the cybersecurity and privacy work. I could see certain standards of the law that seem obvious to me will not be the standard 20 years from now. Like by way of example, where there's a privacy breach or a hack, the current standard is to say the people whose information was lost by the company have suffered no injury. That's currently what the courts are saying. And you didn't say how you were injured when your personal information went out on the network. And basically they're saying, unless you can prove that your identity was stolen and a credit card was accessed, that you can't prove injury. It seems obvious to me that with the evolving ideas of privacy that it's going to be per se damage to you when you lose your privacy from somebody that you entrusted it with.
Absolutely.
It seems inevitable to me that that's going to happen in a period of time. But right now, that's not the case. We're going to deal with fits and starts in this crypto space in the same way, where they're not going to understand the underlying nuances that Alessandro was talking with us about, that you and Andrej have been illuminating us on. And we're going to get bad outcomes. Hopefully, the process of incorporating and digesting those fits and starts will make the civil law that you were discussing better, make the deliberative process and crystallize issues better, and then we can hand it off to that framework. But the arc on that is long against the face of this the technology. It's going to be 10 years, and until then, Jen and I are going to be standing up and arguing a lot.
I think that's right. And so the question about common law versus civil law, I can say anecdotally, when we've had, I'll say, an old fact pattern, but with new technology. One example I'm thinking of that our firm handled, a journalist was attacked over Twitter. Journalist has epilepsy. Someone maliciously targeted him with strobes, those flashing images, and our client had a seizure because of this person targeting him. And those were common law claims of assault, battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress. And we got a court ruling pretty early on that we were able to state a cause of action despite this being a totally new medium over Twitter, of all places. So, anecdotally, the common law, there is a lot of flexibility there to, bring, I think, some of these claims in these new, where we're testing the boundaries with new technologies. But, the civil law, that'll catch up too at some point, to Chris's point.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm going to challenge you guys on your civil common law thing, because there's one thing that I think we can all agree on with regard to the internet, is that it doesn't like walled gardens. Anytime someone has built a walled garden, someone's going to come along and say no. Blockchain networks, by definition, I would say, but I may be wrong, are de facto worldwide networks. So they are already the antithesis of walled gardens. Within that reality, how do you then start applying jurisdictional approach? I don't really see it happening.
Well, jurisdictional approach is a problem, but the idea of there being borderless walls has existed, right? Like, we've had transnational corporations and we're able to regulate them jurisdiction by jurisdiction. The crypto, I would not say is wallless. I'd say the walls are cryptographical when we're talking about these systems, right? Like, as opposed to the norms of business structures. You're right, there are going to be challenges. Not the least challenge is the decentralization that we were talking about. Because how do you regulate when you don't know to whom to actually speak? Right? Like, to whom does the subpoena go? Where do you go to make sure they flip the switch you need flipped? That's
well, you can't. That's the whole point.
This is related with the impossibility of enforceability I was talking about in the beginning.
Yeah.
It's very difficult, especially when we are talking about people that are completely anonymous. It becomes very, very difficult.
it gets very hard. And you're right, there could be some circumstances where the governments are not going to be able to take action. But in most, they are. Like if you had asked 5 years ago, would it be possible to forfeit $3+ billion worth of stolen Bitcoin? You'd say, yeah, that's impossible. They did it last week.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, it's a whole podcast by itself, so or
Yeah.
a movie or a series.
No, I think one of the things that Andre mentioned before, echoing a bit my thoughts, and I'm sure Fab's, is that this is first a social system. So maybe a lot of that dispute resolution process that normally would be delegated to some jurisdictional entity, will be taken care of on a, we'll call it, community basis, regardless of where that community happens to reside in the world. And I think there's, to go to Jen's point about the attack on this journalist, this is also a technology that's grown out of previous technologies, previous abilities to communicate and use the internet and use social, cheap forms of communication, whether it's social media, Discord channels, discourse sites, whatever. Here we've got 4 countries, people from 4 different countries. Ideally, we would have had even a few more. We can do this today. We can talk amongst ourselves. We can resolve our problems if we have a good intent to resolve our problems without calling in some kind of jurisdictional or institutional actor to resolve our disputes. So I think one of the hardest ideas to get our minds around, or I know it was difficult for me, was from viewing blockchain as a purely economic system to a social economic system, and where the social is actually quite important, much more so than you would have in a, right, but much more so than you would have in a corporation, transnational or not. Because it gives people identity, If I can, back in the 90s when I first started working, it was really cool to say, oh, I'm a GE-er, I'm an IBM-er. Even if you were from India or Pakistan, I'm an IBM-er. Yeah, great. There was this identity with this corporate culture that allows you to do things that in your real world culture you can't do because it respects different rules. So, some people in this field are even thinking, is this possibly the end of the nation state as an organizational tool?
Yeah. One point I wanted to touch upon is this idea that the regulatory framework still has to grow and whatever is also related to the fact that, as Andre was saying, we, like, even the developers that create things, they usually have no real idea of what they are doing. So what I mean is, for instance, in a few years ago, I think 2016, if not even earlier, someone created the concept of token. And then in 2017, we had the ICO boom and everyone was tokenizing everything. The point is, back in the day, basically everyone had understood that this concept of tokenization was very powerful and very useful, but no one really had a clear understanding of how to employ it in the right way. So the space was flooded with projects that were absolutely idiotic, but that was a necessary step. Then everything, collapsed. We had a huge bear market. And that's when, some people say, wait a second, this concept of token is not completely useless. Like, it has to be used in the wrong way. And, they sat down and they created DeFi, basically. DeFi is all based on the ERC20 standard. Basically, you put money in a vault and you get tokens representing the share of this vault that you own and stuff like that. And now we are, I think, seeing the same thing with NFTs. Everyone has this idea in mind that NFTs are going to be very useful. I would say that the overwhelming majority of people out there still don't know precisely how useful they will become. And we'll have to witness another huge collapse of a lot of these like projects that do absolutely nothing before someone comes and, creates a nice use case. But I would argue that, this kind of cyclicity of creating something, going through a sort of scummy phase where, a lot of snake oil gets produced, and then getting to a phase where the things crystallizes and becomes useful is necessary for technology. So it's very difficult to draft a regulatory framework when we are in the snake oil phase, because we don't want that, but it's somehow necessary often to go to the phase where things work in the end. And another problem I wanted to touch with technologies in general, and I think this is very relevant, it's something that we still didn't solve on a regular, from a regulatory point of view, is that internet is very peculiar in the fact that it's probably one of the very few environments where monopoly may benefit the end consumer. So what I mean is, the nice thing about Uber is that wherever I go, in whatever country I go, Uber works. If I had to download a Uber for every city I visit, that would be a nightmare. From the point of view of the customer, I'm actually, very incentivized to say, let's just get over with this and, just elect one winner that takes all. I install their app and I use their service worldwide. But this is it's really an anti-pattern, in a capitalistic society that, at least in theory, should incentivize competition. So there's also this problem that in a fully decentralized system, at the moment, for instance, we have a ton of coins that do different things. But, from the standpoint of final utility, it may be that you just want one coin to win this race. Yeah, and then you know that you can pay in every shop you go with that coin, for instance.
That is, that's kind of the point of Peter Thiel's book, 0 to 1, the benevolence of monopolies. And it kind of builds off of the teachings of the Austrian-American economist Schumpeter, who's kind of a favorite of tech pros. The idea being that you should have like this kind of disruptive innovation and then grant a monopoly to incentivize and also spread out the benefits of it. I'm just giving a couple of citations to Fab.
Yeah, one add-on, when we talk, I'm thinking about other technological fields when there's always that experimental phase, and then the technology matures to a point where a lot of times there's a standardization effort. And I'm wondering if the decentralized aspect here lends itself, or arguably does not lend itself, to that kind of process. And by standardization, I mean on both the tech, right, the protocol for how these systems work. And then Fabs, I think to your point about the monopoly, will there just be one company utilizing that tech, or one group or whatever entity that is using that same platform? Are we going to have a lot of different platforms that use a similar or same underlying technology protocol?
Yeah, Actually, it's, now that you make me think about it, it's a miracle that, you know, we have actually in the blockchain space, standards are often the first thing to appear. Like token standards basically came up before tokenization, you know, like even with ERC 721, the NFT standard, you know, that was basically created out of the CryptoKitties project, and then everyone else picked it up. I think it's actually the way, probably the really interesting thing is that the way blockchain works somehow forces you to set up standards before everything else. Because the real tenet of a lot of these ideas is that things are ownable and transferable. As soon as you say that something is transferable, you want to create a marketplace for it, and to do so, you need a standard, which is why token and non-fungible token standards came out very quickly. So yeah, that's a miracle when you think about it. People could have been arguing for ages instead of doing that, but they didn't.
You know, to go back to your point earlier about tokenization, you know, yes, there is a lot of improper tokenization that went on and probably still goes on. But Bitcoin doesn't need a Bitcoin token to work. The token is part of the incentivization structure for building the network to get people to want to participate, want to build the network, bring their equipment. But aside from that, it works perfectly fine without it. So is the value in the token? Is the financial market that we're talking about, that the regulator needs to regulate, the value of the token, or is it the value of the fee? Should they be focusing on the fee market, or should they be focusing on the actual market for blocks? If you've got a a token reward. You know, a lot of the financial regulation is sticking with just the top level market, the price of the token, and who can influence it, and how it can be influenced, and whether it's a properly valued asset. But if you abstract away the token and think about these businesses or these economic systems, or socioeconomic systems to be more precise, I think you start looking at it in a very different manner. It's like, okay, yeah, I'm raising money, but I'm not issuing a token. I'm building a network or a smart contract that doesn't need its own token.
Well, yeah, that happened. For instance, the Arbitrum layer 2 took exactly this decision. They didn't issue a token because they said we are building a layer 2 for the Ethereum network, and all the fees and stuff should be paid in Ethereum. I would argue that, yeah, sometimes we see a lot of unnecessary tokens being produced, basically because the developers need a way to pay their bills. Mm-hmm. So, you know, if you come up with an idea, maybe that makes something better, maybe you don't need a token to develop that, but it's the easiest way to raise money to finance your idea. And this is a very dangerous concept, by the way, because sometimes people, you know, you can see these projects that maybe have a very nice idea underneath, but it gets completely buried under layers of incentive mechanisms that are completely useless, and they are there just because, you know, the developers need to pay their bills. They have no other way, if not, you know, coming up with these weird systems. Many governance tokens are like that.
Yeah, one of the ironic things about this market is that these people have, people have developed these systems with, billions and billions of dollars locked in it, but they can't pay themselves. There's no way to find, they're just confused. How do I do this and make a living?
No, but that's because we might be conflating things, because you have like L0s, L1s, L2s, and also like now the regulator in Europe is following the ICO boom right now. And this is like, it doesn't exist as a problem anymore because it has been self-regulated. No one is doing classical ICOs anymore, but this is where our regulation is. NFTs now, there's so many problems at the moment, but I think in 2 years, when the regulator be catching up to those will not exist anymore also. And like, yes, developers on the most developed networks, they cannot issue tokens anymore. They cannot, or there's no consensus within the community that you could issue tokens for this. So they are dependent on grants. So like how decentralized are. So there's so many questions which are really different. So you would need to segment this, like, let's talk about Bitcoin separately, Ethereum separately, then like projects building on top separately, then does it matter? Do you really need a token? Can you be still efficient even though you are capturing a part of the value on purpose? It's like there's so many different questions, and this is why I started with this, that we're so early. If I were the regulator, I wouldn't know where to start, honestly, without endangering the development. And on the other hand, as Fab said before, it's like it's really also hard to stop something in blockchain. Like you can go after a person, but in a decentralized system, it's like it's the keys, you don't have access to anything. In the other, it's like, again, it's different enough to need a regulator to really take time, in my opinion, to understand, because I don't need to understand what blockchain is fully or where it is going, because like it's social, it's complex, many different projects, many different views, and most of the stuff we said would be like for Bitcoiners, they would really not be happy with our discussion because they do not recognize Ethereum as anything except as a scam coin. No, this is like for Ethereans, like
they're very conservative. They don't believe in the go fast and break things ethos.
So if a regulator would go to Bitcoiners, they would say like all the other projects are scams, and so that's sort of a problem. So again, I'm not saying, and I'm not saying I have the answers, and this is why. And some politicians are like having this stance, and like it's coming from let's say specific points. Like Ted Cruz is really giving an opinion which I would sort of agree with. Wait, don't stop the development. But we know what people think of Ted Cruz, maybe in the same circle. So it's like it's really. It's interesting. And it's still early, and just making hasty decisions cannot kill blockchain, in my opinion, but could really limit the development. And that's like how to find. And plus, we really need to fight scams. And getting the 4 billion back from the hack is a brilliant thing. So this is something really good, and the regulator did it within what they already have. So like it's a bit.
There's also a huge problem, by the way, about like what Ted Cruz said. There's a huge problem of regulatory pressure, because at the moment, blockchain is really a polarizing kind of thing. There are people that are basically enthusiastic about it, and there are tons of people that, they don't want to hear anything about it. They just say, no, it's a scam, full stop. NFTs is the same thing. Like my timeline is completely like schizophrenic. You have like one side of people that are like marketing their art full time, and the other side of people saying, no, this is horrible, it's a scam. And the problem is that these people that are strictly against the technology, many of them probably don't even know what it is, but they're against it. are obviously putting pressure on the regulators. Some of them are writing to their own members of parliament saying, hey, you have to do something about it. And I think that's the real danger. It's like, we should wait it out. We should wait for a bit before drafting regulation. But, we may not have the time.